Hi, I'm Adrian Hernandez, a cardiologist from Duke, and I just had the pleasure of moderating today's late-breaking science session. And here with me is Paul Kalra, who is the PI for the IRONMAN study, which was really an interesting, fascinating study that will have an impact on the field. So Paul, tell us a little bit about the background for why you did this.
Thank you. We know that iron deficiency is very common in patients with heart failure, perhaps affecting up to 50% of ambulatory outpatients, and it associates with impaired quality of life, exercise capacity, and patients have a higher risk of heart failure hospitalization and death. We've had a number of studies that have shown that correcting iron deficiency with intravenous ferric carboxymaltose has shown that it can improve quality of life and exercise capacity certainly to 24 weeks. And then we had a study called AFFIRM-AHF that looked at a specific group of patients hospitalized with heart failure, and when iron deficiency was treated, again with ferric carboxymaltose, it reduced rehospitalizations out to a year. However, we still do not know the longer-term efficacy and safety, importantly, of intravenous iron in patients with heart failure, and that was the rationale for designing the IRONMAN trial.
Great. And what was the basic design elements?
So this was a trial with a different iron product called ferric diisomortose. It's given according to the patient's weight and hemoglobin, and we can give it as a high dose with a view of trying to correct patients' iron deficiency with a single infusion where possible. It was a probe design, so a prospective open label blinded endpoint, and the reason why it was open label was because it's difficult to mask or blind for a long period of time patients with intravenous iron versus a placebo. So it was blinded endpoint adjudication, and all hospitalization and deaths were processed in that fashion. It was one-to-one randomization, and it included patients with heart failure and reduced ejection fraction, an EF of less than or equal to 45%, and a broad range of patients, including those hospitalized, those with a recent heart failure hospitalization, and if they hadn't had a recent hospitalization for heart failure, elevated natriuretic peptides. And patients were followed 4 weeks, 4 months, and if they were in intravenous iron arm, they were redosed if they became iron deficient again.
Great. Some really unique design features, the intervention, the design of the study in terms of the outcome assessment. Now, what were the results? What did you share with the group today?
Absolutely. So the primary endpoint was a combination of recurrent heart failure hospitalizations and cardiovascular death. The trial was markedly impacted by COVID, actually. So we completed the trial earlier this year, and we find that when COVID hit the UK, end of March 2020, there were periods of time where we were unable to see patients for research purposes, and even when we were able, many patients were reluctant to come to hospital. And so there was a concern that in the intravenous iron arm, we may not be detecting repeated iron deficiency and therefore under-treating that. So we set in place a pre-specified COVID analysis, censoring patients at the end of March 2020, following them for another 6 months, because our clinical experience is very much that once corrected, it's the minority of patients needing redosing over that period of time. But what we found for the overall cohort of patients, which is 1,137 patients across 70 UK sites, was that it reduced the risk of the primary endpoint with a rate ratio of 0.82, but a p-value of 0.07, so it didn't reach the statistical significant point. If we looked at the secondary endpoints, including heart failure hospitalization and cardiovascular death, those events were numerically fewer with intravenous iron, but again didn't reach statistical significance. In contrast, when we look at the COVID pre-specified sensitivity analysis data to try and mitigate the risks or the impact of COVID, which actually included 91% of the patient cohort, we found that it had a 24% reduction in the relative risk of the primary endpoint, and that reached statistical significance with a p-value of less than 0.05. So there were a few other things. At 4 months, we found an improvement in quality of life when assessed by Minnesota Living with Heart Failure questionnaire assessment, but that didn't continue out to 20 months. Right. And one just other important thing to add, that the results were found despite in the usual care arm, even though they weren't supposed to receive iron, about 1 in 6 patients, so 17%, received iron at some point out of the study.
Right, right. Well, what was the bottom line conclusion that you shared with the audience?
I think building on the data we have in this emerging field as a potential treatment, I think it adds weight to the importance of iron deficiency, and certainly it's very, very important for us to go looking for it. And I think when we find iron deficiency now in a broad range of patients with heart failure, certainly we've got the evidence that it improves patient well-being in the short term. I think we've now got data, increasing data, to support the fact that it helps improve outcomes, and in particular suggesting that it reduces the risk of heart failure hospitalization. Another thing that we've extended from other trials is that the median follow-up was 2.7 years, and the safety data were excellent. There wasn't a signal of adverse effect from intravenous ferric maltose in any of the organ classes, according to MEDRA.
Right. Well, it's certainly important to kind of build on the totality of evidence as we try to address heart failure issues, and especially areas which have not been traditionally a focus in the clinical community. Now, last question. Take us behind the scenes. This trial was done during COVID times. Every place is a bit different with COVID. What was it like in the UK? Like, what did you guys have to deal with during the COVID period?
Yeah, no, it was just a bit of a challenge, to say the least. This was a publicly funded. It was a trial supported by the British Heart Foundation, although we did have a drug and some research funds from Pharmacosmos. And so actually when COVID hit in late March 2020, a lot of research staff in the UK were pulled to clinical roles. There was a major vaccination program that was excellent in the UK, but involved in the research. So it was very difficult to even have the research staff available to try and conduct the visits. But then there were periods of time in national lockdowns where patients just weren't allowed to come up to hospital. So different to a tablet study where you could post the drugs, we needed to be seeing people, assessing, and we needed to have them in person to potentially redose them.
Right, right. Well, just congratulations to you and your team and all the investigators, study teams, and participants for another great trial, which will have an impact on the field. So thanks for sharing your results and your story.